A fateful encounter. The small, sun-soaked neighborhood of Preston Hollow had been home to Margaret Ellison for more than 5 decades. At 78 years old, Margaret had lived a life filled with both struggle and triumph. Her home was modest, but filled with warmth, a testament to years of hard work and resilience. She had raised her son, Marcus, here, guiding him from a mischievous boy to a disciplined and honorable man. Marcus had gone on to serve in the U.S. Army, climbing the ranks to become a highly respected colonel. Despite his demanding career, he never missed a chance to call his mother, a routine that grounded them both. Margaret's mornings were sacred. Each day began with a steaming cup of tea, a gentle stretch on her porch, and the melody of birds weaving through the quiet streets. But this day was different. A trip to the grocery store awaited, along with her weekly visit to the church to drop off donations for the less fortunate. She slid into her weathered but dependable green Buick, the car's groan of familiarity easing her nerves. Margaret believed in routine and simplicity, and the car, much like her, carried the scars of age, but ran with unrelenting determination. As she drove through the winding streets of her neighborhood, her thoughts wandered to the past, how Preston Hollow had changed over the years, becoming more vibrant yet increasingly complex. Margaret pulled onto Main Street, humming softly to herself. Traffic was light, the sky bright, and everything seemed ordinary. That is, until the piercing wail of a police siren broke through her reverie. Startled, she checked her rearview mirror. The flashing blue lights of a patrol car loomed close behind her. Confused, Margaret slowed her car to a stop along the curb, her heart thudding in her chest. She couldn't recall breaking any traffic laws. Was there something wrong with her car? Had she missed a sign? She rolled down her window and waited as a tall, broad-shouldered officer stepped out of the cruiser and approached her vehicle. License and registration. Officer Daniels barked, his tone sharp and impatient. Margaret's hands trembled as she reached into her bag. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. Daniels adjusted his sunglasses, peering down at her with a look that could freeze fire. "You tell me," he retorted, snatching her documents. "Driving slow, switching lanes like you own the road. What's your excuse?" "I'm sorry if I caused trouble," Margaret replied cautiously. "I didn't realize I—" Daniels cut her off. "Save it. You people always have an excuse." The words stung, but Margaret kept her composure. "I don't understand," she said gently. "I've done nothing wrong." Daniels leaned closer, his face inches from hers. "Step out of the car. Now." Margaret hesitated. "Is that necessary, sir? I'm an elderly woman." "Out!" Daniels snapped, yanking the door open. He grabbed Margaret's wrist, his grip harsh. "Move it, slave." The venom in his voice hung in the air like a storm cloud. Margaret froze, disbelief washing over her. The word hit her like a physical blow, dredging up a history of pain and injustice she thought she'd left behind. Around them, pedestrians stopped and stared, their murmurs of confusion quickly growing into outrage. Phones were raised, cameras recording the scene, but Daniels didn't seem to care. His authority was his armor, and he wore it brazenly. Margaret, her frail frame no match for the officer's brute force, allowed herself to be pulled from the car. She stumbled as Daniels shoved her toward the hood, his handcuffs cold and unforgiving on her wrists. A few of her belongings spilled from her purse onto the pavement, including a small framed photograph. A bystander picked it up and gasped. "Hey, isn't this Colonel Marcus Ellison?" "That's his mom." The name echoed through the gathering crowd like a lightning strike. People whispered and murmured, their expressions shifting from outrage to alarm. Margaret turned her head slightly, catching the bystander's words. A flicker of hope ignited in her chest. Daniels froze, his grip faltering as his eyes darted toward the photo. Though his sunglasses hid his expression, his body language betrayed him. Recognition set in, and with it, a flicker of panic. "That's Colonel Ellison's mom." Someone shouted again. "You messed with the wrong woman." Daniels straightened, trying to regain control of the situation. "Back off," he barked at the crowd, his voice louder but shakier than before. "This is a police matter." Margaret, though shaken, felt a spark of defiance stir within her. She stood straighter, despite the handcuffs biting into her wrists. She looked Daniels directly in the eye, unflinching. "This isn't over," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of generations of resilience. From within the crowd, someone dialed a number, their fingers shaking with urgency. It wasn't long before Margaret's son, Colonel Marcus Ellison, received a call that would set in motion a reckoning no one could have anticipated. The reckoning begins. Margaret Ellison sat in the dimly lit holding cell, her hands resting on her lap. The sterile walls and cold, metallic bench did little to distract her from the turmoil within her heart. The events of the day replayed in her mind like a broken record. The flashing lights, the venom in Officer Daniels' voice, and most of all, the word that still echoed in her ears: slave. Despite her outward calm, Margaret felt anger bubbling beneath the surface, not just for herself, but for every person who had ever been belittled, disregarded, or dehumanized. She thought of Marcus, her son, her pride. How would he feel when he found out what had happened to her? A part of her wished he wouldn't. She didn't want to burden him with this pain, but deep down, she knew he would find out soon enough. The officer on duty outside her cell was a younger man, perhaps in his late 20s. He avoided making eye contact with her, shuffling paperwork and glancing nervously toward the hallway every so often. Margaret could tell he wasn't comfortable with what had happened. That was some solace, though small. The sound of heavy boots echoed down the corridor, each step purposeful and unrelenting. Margaret looked up, her heart skipping a beat. She couldn't see who was approaching, but the tension in the air shifted, heavy and foreboding. The door to the holding area swung open, and in strode Colonel Marcus Ellison, his broad shoulders and military uniform commanding the room. His face was a mask of calm professionalism, but his dark eyes burned with restrained fury. Behind him trailed the station's watch commander, a wiry man with a receding hairline and a nervous expression. "Colonel Ellison," the watch commander began, his voice strained, "I assure you, this is all a misunderstanding." Marcus held up a hand, silencing him instantly. Without breaking stride, he approached the cell and met his mother's gaze. "Are you okay, Mom?" he asked, his voice steady but soft, a stark contrast to the storm brewing inside him. Margaret managed a small smile. "I'm fine, Marcus," she said, though her voice trembled slightly. "You didn't have to come all this way." "Yes, I did," he replied firmly. He turned to the watch commander. "Why is she in a cell?" The watch commander shifted uncomfortably. "Well, Officer Daniels said she was obstructing traffic and resisting." "Spare me the excuses," Marcus interrupted, his voice rising slightly. "I've seen the videos." The younger officer outside Margaret's cell flinched visibly. The tension in the room grew thicker as Marcus stepped closer to the watch commander, his imposing presence forcing the man to take a step back. "Release her, now," Marcus commanded. The watch commander hesitated. "Colonel, there's a process." Marcus took another step forward, his voice dropping to a dangerous low. "You're going to release her, or I'll ensure this entire precinct is under federal investigation by the end of the day. Do you understand me?" The younger officer fumbled with the keys, stepping forward to unlock the cell. Margaret's heart swelled with pride as Marcus stood protectively between her and the others. When the cell door swung open, Marcus offered his hand to his mother. She took it, standing tall despite the exhaustion weighing on her. "Let's go," Marcus said, leading her toward the exit. As they walked through the station, every pair of eyes followed them. Some officers looked away, ashamed or uncertain, while others bristled with indignation. Margaret could feel their stares, but she held her head high, drawing strength from her son's unwavering presence. They reached the front lobby, where Officer Daniels stood, arms crossed, trying to exude the authority he thought was his by default. His face turned red as he saw Marcus and Margaret approaching. "Colonel Ellison," Daniels began, his tone mocking, "you can't just walk in here and—" Marcus didn't even let him finish. "Officer Daniels," he said sharply, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. "You will address me as Colonel. Do I make myself clear?" Daniels faltered, his bravado cracking for the first time. "Yes, Colonel," he mumbled. "Good," Marcus said, stepping closer. "You will explain to me, here and now, why you thought it was acceptable to call my mother, an elderly, law-abiding citizen, a slave. Speak carefully." Daniel's jaw clenched, his eyes darting toward the watch commander as if seeking backup. I didn't mean it like that," he stammered. "Oh." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Then how exactly did you mean it?" The room fell silent. Officers behind desks stopped what they were doing. A few onlookers outside pressed their faces to the glass, their curiosity piqued by the scene unfolding before them. Daniel stammered again but couldn't form a coherent response. Marcus shook his head, his expression a mix of disgust and disappointment. "You don't have an answer because there isn't one. Your behavior is inexcusable." He turned to the watch commander. "I'll be filing a formal complaint and escalating this to every authority necessary. Daniel should not be wearing that badge, and if he's still employed by the end of the week, this entire department will have to answer for it." The watch commander nodded quickly, sweat beading on his brow. "Understood, Colonel." Without another word, Marcus led his mother out of the station and into the fresh air. The murmurs of the crowd outside rose as they saw Margaret walking free, her head held high. Marcus opened the passenger door of his car for her, and she slid in, her composure finally giving way to a wave of relief. As they drove away, Margaret glanced at her son, his face set in a grim expression. "You didn't have to do all that, Marcus," she said softly. "Yes, I did," he replied, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. "What they did to you is unacceptable. And it's not just about you, Mom. It's about every person they've treated like this." Margaret reached over, placing a hand on his arm. "I'm proud of you," she said. "But don't lose yourself in this fight." Marcus nodded, though the fire in his eyes didn't diminish. "I won't, Mom. But they're going to learn that they messed with the wrong family." As they drove home, Marcus began planning his next steps. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. What Officer Daniels had done wasn't just an insult to his mother. It was an indictment of a system that had failed too many for too long. And Marcus Ellison wasn't the kind of man to let that stand. A firestorm ignites. The news broke before Margaret and Marcus had even finished their dinner that evening. Clips from the confrontation at the station, the arrest footage, and the crowd's growing outrage spread like wildfire across social media. Dozens of bystander videos painted a clear and damning picture of what had occurred. A decorated military colonel's mother, an elderly woman, was dragged from her car, demeaned, and handcuffed without cause. Marcus sat at the kitchen table, his laptop glowing in front of him. The hashtags #JusticeForMargaret and #FireDaniels were trending. Comments flooded in, messages of outrage, solidarity, and disbelief. People demanded answers from the precinct, and news outlets had already begun reaching out for interviews. Margaret sat across from him, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. Her face was calm, but Marcus could see the weight of the day hanging heavy on her shoulders. She had always been a quiet fighter, a woman who believed in keeping her head down and persevering. But this wasn't a battle she could fight alone, and Marcus wasn't going to let her. "This is bigger than us now," Marcus said, breaking the silence. He gestured toward the screen. "People are paying attention." Margaret nodded slowly. "I see that, Marcus. But attention isn't always a good thing. I don't want you to put yourself in harm's way for me." Marcus frowned. "Mom, this isn't just about you. It's about every person Daniels and officers like him have mistreated. You've seen the comments. Others are coming forward. He's done this before." Margaret sighed, looking into her tea. "I just don't want this to get ugly. I've lived a long life, Marcus. I've seen how these things can spiral. Marcus reached across the table and placed his hand over hers. It's already ugly, Mom. But we're going to do this the right way. A knock at the door startled them both. Marcus rose, his military instincts kicking in as he approached cautiously. Peering through the window, he saw a young woman holding a microphone, accompanied by a cameraman. Her neatly pressed blazer and warm smile didn't fool him. She was here for a story. Colonel Ellison. She called through the door. I'm Rachel Williams from Channel 7 News. We're covering the incident involving your mother. Marcus hesitated for a moment before opening the door slightly. This isn't a good time, he said firmly. Rachel's expression softened. I understand, Colonel, but the public needs to hear your side of the story. People are outraged, and your voice could make a difference. Margaret appeared behind Marcus, her calm presence steadying him. Let her in, Marcus, she said softly. Mom, are you sure? He asked, turning to her. She nodded. If this story is going to be told, it should be told right. Reluctantly, Marcus stepped aside, allowing Rachel and her cameraman to enter. They set up quickly in the living room, their professionalism a stark contrast to the chaos that had brought them here. Margaret sat on the couch, her hands folded neatly in her lap, while Marcus stood protectively beside her. The interview began with Rachel addressing Margaret. Mrs. Ellison, thank you for speaking with us. Can you tell us in your own words what happened? Margaret took a deep breath before answering. I was driving to the grocery store, like I've done 100 times before. I wasn't speeding, and I wasn't breaking any laws. But the officer pulled me over, and... She paused, her voice trembling slightly. And he called me a slave. He dragged me out of my car like I was a criminal. Rachel's face tightened with sympathy. And how did that make you feel? Margaret met her gaze, her voice steadying. It broke my heart. Not just for me, but for what it says about how far we still have to go. I've lived through times when words like that were used to keep us in our place. I never thought I'd hear it again. Rachel nodded, then turned to Marcus. Colonel Ellison, you've served this country with distinction. What was your reaction when you saw the footage of your mother's arrest? Marcus's jaw tightened. I was furious. My mother taught me about respect and dignity. She's the reason I joined the military, to protect those values. Seeing her treated like that, by someone who's supposed to uphold the law, it was unacceptable. Rachel leaned forward slightly. What do you want to see happen next? Marcus didn't hesitate. Accountability. Daniels needs to be fired, and the precinct needs to answer for why he was allowed to behave like this. But it's bigger than him. This is about systemic issues in law enforcement that need to be addressed. The interview concluded with Margaret sharing a message of hope. I don't want hate or anger to define this, she said. I want it to lead to change. For my son, for my community, for everyone. Once the crew packed up and left, the house fell silent again. Marcus turned to his mother. You didn't have to do that. Margaret smiled faintly. I know, but I wanted to. By the time the interview aired that night, the response was overwhelming. The footage of Margaret's calm dignity, juxtaposed against the raw anger of her son, struck a chord. Protests began forming outside the police station, peaceful but resolute. Signs demanding justice for Margaret and accountability for Daniels filled the streets. Meanwhile, Marcus's phone buzzed incessantly. Calls and messages poured in, from military colleagues, old friends, and even strangers offering their support. Among them was a text from Jasmine Carter, a prominent civil rights attorney. Colonel Ellison, my name is Jasmine Carter. I saw the story about your mother. I'd like to help you take this fight further. Call me if you're interested. Marcus stared at the message for a moment, then turned to his mother. Mom, I think we just found an ally. Margaret looked up from her tea, her expression weary but resolute. Good, she said simply. We're going to need all the help we can get. The battle lines are drawn. The days following Margaret's televised interview were a whirlwind of activity. The story had ignited a firestorm. sparking outrage across the country. News outlets replayed the clips of her arrest on a loop, and the footage of Marcus confronting Officer Daniels at the station became a rallying cry for accountability in law enforcement. At the Ellison household, life was anything but quiet. Marcus had transformed the dining room into a makeshift command center, papers and laptops spread across the table as he coordinated with community leaders, civil rights organizations, and concerned citizens. Margaret, though weary, remained a pillar of calm amidst the chaos, often retreating to her favorite chair with a cup of tea and a book. But even she couldn't ignore the buzz of activity that had enveloped their once peaceful home. One morning, Marcus sat at the dining table with Jasmine Carter, the civil rights attorney who had reached out after seeing their story. She was sharp and confident, her dark eyes blazing with determination as she laid out their strategy. "This isn't just about Officer Daniels," Jasmine began, her voice firm. "The leaked emails suggest a pattern of systemic corruption in the precinct. This could be the case that sets a precedent for real reform." Marcus nodded, his arms crossed as he listened intently. "What's our first move?" Jasmine slid a folder across the table. "We file a civil suit against the department for violating your mother's civil rights, but we're also going to push for a federal investigation. If we can prove that this isn't an isolated incident, we could force systemic changes." Margaret, who had been listening quietly from the doorway, stepped forward. "What kind of changes?" she asked. Jasmine turned to her with a respectful nod. "Independent oversight of misconduct investigations, mandatory de-escalation training, and better accountability mechanisms for officers like Daniels. But it won't be easy. The police union is already circling the wagons." Marcus frowned. "What do you mean?" Jasmine sighed. "They're claiming Daniels is being unfairly targeted. They're trying to paint your mother as combative and you as using your rank to intimidate. It's a classic playbook, but we're ready for it." Margaret's lips tightened, but she remained composed. "I've been called worse than combative. Ms. Carter, they can say what they want. The truth will speak for itself." Jasmine smiled. "That's the spirit we need." That evening, Marcus received a call from one of his military colleagues, Captain Aaron Turner, who had been monitoring the situation closely. "Marcus," Turner began, his voice tinged with urgency, "I just got word that some folks in the precinct are leaking information about you. They're trying to dig up dirt, anything they can use to discredit you and your mother." Marcus's grip on his phone tightened. "Let them dig. They won't find anything." "Just watch your back," Turner cautioned. "This is going to get uglier before it gets better." After hanging up, Marcus relayed the conversation to Jasmine, who was unsurprised. "It's standard practice when people like Daniels are cornered," she said. "We need to stay focused and not let them distract us." The following morning, a new development added fuel to the fire. Jasmine received a tip from a whistleblower within the department, a young officer who had grown increasingly disillusioned with the culture of silence and impunity. The whistleblower, Officer Andrew Morales, agreed to meet with Marcus, Margaret, and Jasmine in a quiet corner of a local cafe. He was visibly nervous, glancing over his shoulder repeatedly as he spoke. "I can't stay long," Morales said, his voice low. "But I needed to come forward. Daniels has a long history of complaints. Excessive force, racial profiling, verbal abuse. The department always sweeps it under the rug." Jasmine leaned forward. "Do you have proof?" Morales slid a flash drive across the table. "It's all here. Internal reports, emails, and even body cam footage that was lost, but never deleted from the server. Daniels isn't the only one. There are others." Marcus stared at the young officer, his respect for him growing with each passing second. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. Morales looked at Margaret, his expression softening. "Because what happened to your mother could have happened to mine, and I'm tired of being part of a system that protects bad cops." Jasmine tucked the flash drive into her bag. "You've done the right thing, Officer Morales. This could change everything." Morales nodded and stood quickly. "Be careful," he said before slipping out of the cafe. The whistleblower's evidence was damning. The flash drive contained dozens of internal complaints against Daniels and several other officers, as well as emails showing how senior officials had actively worked to suppress them. But the most shocking revelation was a piece of body cam footage from 6 months prior. Daniels berating a young black man during a traffic stop, his language nearly identical to what he had said to Margaret. Jasmine wasted no time. She coordinated with a local news outlet to release the footage and the internal documents. Within hours, the story went live, and the response was explosive. Protests outside the precinct swelled to unprecedented numbers. People marched with signs that read, "Justice for Margaret" and "End police corruption." Social media erupted, with calls for Daniels to be fired and the department to be held accountable. But not everyone was supportive. Anonymous threats began pouring in, emails, voicemails, even a note left on Marcus's car. "Stay quiet, or you'll regret it," the note read. Marcus showed it to Jasmine, who immediately contacted the authorities. "We'll take extra precautions," she assured him. But this only proves we're hitting a nerve. As the battle raged on, Marcus and Margaret found themselves thrust into the spotlight. News anchors praised their courage, activists hailed them as symbols of resilience, and ordinary citizens sent messages of gratitude and support. But the pressure was immense, and the weight of the fight began to take its toll. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, Margaret turned to Marcus. "Are you sure we're doing the right thing?" she asked quietly. Marcus looked at her, his eyes filled with determination. "Yes, Mom. This isn't just about us. It's about making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." Margaret smiled faintly, her hand resting on his. "Then let's see it through." Justice on trial. The Ellison home had become a hub of activity. Activists, attorneys, and journalists came and went, all united in their quest to shine a light on the corruption Margaret's case had uncovered. Margaret, though weary, remained the steady heart of the movement. Marcus, as always, was her shield and sword, standing firm against the growing tide of backlash. The lawsuit filed by Jasmine Carter and her team against the precinct had gained significant traction. The evidence provided by Officer Morales had not only strengthened their case, but also drawn the attention of the Department of Justice, which announced a federal investigation into the precinct. The announcement sent shockwaves through the city, and for the first time, Margaret felt the scales beginning to tip. Margaret stood at the window, gazing out at the street where protesters held signs and chanted slogans. The crowd had grown larger over the past week, their determination unwavering. From her vantage point, she could see faces of every age and background, a testament to the power of unity. Marcus entered the room, a folder in his hand and a concerned look on his face. "Mom, we need to talk." She turned to him, her brow furrowing. "What is it?" He handed her the folder. "Threats. Jasmine's team has been compiling them." Margaret opened the folder and flipped through its contents, emails filled with hate, veiled warnings left as voicemails, and photos of Marcus and her taken from a distance. Her chest tightened, but she forced herself to remain calm. "I expected this," she said softly, closing the folder. "When people feel their power slipping, they lash out." Marcus placed a hand on her shoulder. "We're increasing security. I'll make sure someone is here with you at all times." Margaret shook her head. "You can't protect me from everything, Marcus. We have to stay focused on what matters." "I know," Marcus said, his voice firm. "But I'm not taking any chances." The threats escalated as the federal investigation began. One night, a brick was thrown through the Ellisons' front window, shattering the glass and sending shards flying across the living room. Margaret, who had been reading in her chair, was unharmed but visibly shaken. Marcus rushed in from the kitchen, his heart pounding as he scanned the room. "Mom, are you okay?" "I'm fine," she said, though her hands trembled slightly. She pointed to the brick on the floor, a note tied to it with a string. Marcus picked it up, his jaw tightening as he read the words scrawled in red ink. Back off, or next time, it won't be a warning. Jasmine arrived within the hour, accompanied by a security consultant she had hired. The consultant, a tall man named Reed, assessed the situation and began implementing new security measures, cameras, motion sensors, and a rotating schedule of guards to patrol the property. "This isn't just about intimidation," Reed said. "It's about creating fear. Don't let them win." The lawsuit moved forward, with the first hearing scheduled for the following week. Jasmine and her team worked tirelessly, preparing evidence and witness testimonies. Officer Morales had agreed to testify, despite the risk to his career. His courage inspired others, and more whistleblowers began to come forward, their stories painting a damning picture of systemic corruption within the precinct. Meanwhile, Marcus was inundated with interviews and public appearances. He spoke at rallies, addressed community forums, and met with local leaders to advocate for police reform. But the constant spotlight took its toll. Late at night, when the house was quiet, Marcus would sit alone in the kitchen, his mind racing with the weight of his responsibilities. One night, Margaret found him there, staring at his untouched cup of coffee. She sat beside him, her presence grounding him as it always did. "You're carrying too much, Marcus," she said gently. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I have to, Mom. This fight, it's bigger than us." "I know," she replied. "But you can't pour from an empty cup. Let others carry some of the load." He looked at her, his eyes filled with gratitude. "I'll try." The day of the hearing arrived, and the courthouse was surrounded by a sea of protesters and reporters. Inside, the tension was palpable. Margaret sat beside Jasmine, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Marcus sat on her other side, his presence a source of strength. The defense team for the precinct attempted to downplay the significance of the case, arguing that Daniel's actions were an isolated incident. But Jasmine dismantled their arguments with precision, presenting the evidence of systemic issues and highlighting the pattern of abuse. When it was Margaret's turn to testify, the courtroom fell silent. She spoke with quiet dignity, recounting the events of that fateful day and the impact they had on her. Her words were powerful, and more than a few people in the room wiped tears from their eyes. "I've lived a long life," Margaret said, her voice steady. "I've seen the best and worst of humanity, but I believe we can be better. That's why I'm here, not just for myself, but for everyone who deserves justice." As the hearing concluded, the judge announced that the case would proceed to trial. Outside the courthouse, Margaret and Marcus were met with cheers and applause. But as they made their way to the car, Marcus noticed a man in the crowd watching them intently, his expression unreadable. Something about him set Marcus on edge, and he made a mental note to alert Reed. That evening, as Margaret prepared for bed, Marcus sat in his makeshift command center, reviewing the day's events. His phone buzzed with a text from Jasmine. "Great work today. We're making progress, but be careful. They're desperate." Marcus stared at the message, his resolve hardening. The fight was far from over, but he knew one thing for certain. They wouldn't back down, no matter the cost. Escalation and resolve. The aftermath of the brick attack left a mark on both Marcus and Margaret, but it didn't break them. Instead, it deepened their resolve. The Ellison home, now fortified with security cameras and nightly patrols, became a symbol of their unyielding fight for justice. The threats only reinforced their belief that they were exposing something far bigger than Officer Daniels. A fracture in the precinct. The whistleblowers continued to come forward, emboldened by Officer Morell's testimony and the national attention on the case. Jasmine and her team began connecting the dots, uncovering a web of corruption that stretched beyond Daniels. A secret system of incident protections for certain officers revealed itself, complaints being altered, body cam footage disappearing, and disciplinary actions buried under bureaucratic red tape. Jasmine called Marcus late one evening to discuss their findings. "Marcus," she began, her voice tinged with both excitement and exhaustion, "this case is no longer about one officer or one incident. We've uncovered evidence that shows systemic racism and corruption. If this goes to trial, it could expose the entire department." Marcus leaned back in his chair, processing the gravity of her words. "And that's why they're escalating," he said grimly. "They know what's at stake." "Exactly," Jasmine replied. "But we need to prepare for the backlash. The department and the union will pull every dirty trick in the book." Marcus nodded. "Let them try. We're not backing down." The protest turns violent. The protests outside the precinct swelled in size, drawing activists and supporters from across the country. What began as peaceful demonstrations turned chaotic one evening when a counter-protest group arrived, carrying signs that accused Margaret of being a fraud and Marcus of exploiting his military rank. Tensions boiled over as insults and accusations were hurled between the two groups. Then, someone threw a bottle. Chaos erupted as police in riot gear moved in, tear gas canisters popping like firecrackers and filling the air with a choking haze. Margaret watched the live coverage on TV, her heart sinking as she saw young people running from the gas, their faces streaked with tears. She turned to Marcus, who stood by the window, his fists clenched. "They're trying to make us look like the bad guys," Marcus said through gritted teeth. Margaret placed a hand on his arm. "Stay focused, Marcus. They want us angry and reckless. Don't give them that." The attack. The tension reached a boiling point 2 nights later. Marcus was reviewing case notes with Jasmine in the living room when a loud explosion shook the house. The lights flickered, and smoke began to fill the air. The security alarm blared, and Reed, stationed outside, burst through the front door. "Get down," he shouted, ushering Margaret to the floor. Marcus instinctively moved to shield his mother as the smoke thickened. "What happened?" Marcus demanded. "Molotov cocktail," Reed replied tersely, his voice barely audible over the chaos. "They targeted the porch. Firefighters arrived within minutes, extinguishing the flames before they could spread. The damage to the porch was significant, but the house remained intact." Marcus, however, knew this was a turning point. As the firefighters packed up and the police arrived to investigate, Marcus stood in the driveway, staring at the charred remains of the porch. Jasmine joined him, her expression somber. "This isn't just intimidation anymore," she said. "It's an outright attack." "They're desperate," Marcus replied, his voice like steel. "And that means we're winning." The press conference. The next morning, Margaret and Marcus held a press conference outside the courthouse. Reporters crowded around them, cameras flashing as Marcus stepped to the podium. "My family has been targeted with threats, intimidation, and now violence," he began, his voice firm. "But let me be clear, we will not be silenced. This fight isn't just about my mother. It's about every person who has been mistreated, ignored, and dehumanized by a broken system." Margaret stepped forward, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to the fury in Marcus' voice. "I've lived through times of hatred and injustice," she said, her voice steady. "But I also seen the power of unity and resilience. We will not back down because justice is worth fighting for." The crowd erupted in applause, and the press conference was broadcast live across the country. Margaret's quiet strength and Marcus' fierce resolve captured the hearts of many, turning their fight into a national movement. A surprise ally. Later that day, Marcus received an unexpected call. On the other end was the mayor of the city, a man who had largely avoided addressing the controversy until now. "Colonel Ellison," the mayor began, "I want to offer my support. The evidence your team has uncovered is damning, and the city cannot afford to be on the wrong side of history." Marcus narrowed his eyes, unsure of the mayor's motives. "Why now?" he asked bluntly. The mayor hesitated before replying. "Because the tide is turning, and the people are watching. I want to work with you to ensure meaningful reforms are implemented." Marcus agreed to meet with the mayor, though he remained cautious. The fight for justice had revealed allies and enemies in unexpected places, and trust was not something he gave lightly. The trial looms. As the trial date approached, the Ellisons prepared for what would undoubtedly be the fight of their lives. Margaret remained steadfast, her quiet dignity inspiring all who met her. Marcus, ever the protector, vowed to see the battle through to the end. But they both knew the stakes were higher than ever. The attacks, the protests, and the growing backlash were proof that the fight for justice was far from over. Yet, in the midst of it all, Margaret held on to one unshakable belief. The truth, no matter how difficult, would always prevail. The trial and the triumph. The morning of the trial was a storm of activity. The courthouse was surrounded by a throng of protesters, reporters, and curious onlookers. Signs reading "Justice for Margaret" and "End Police Corruption" jostled against others proclaiming support for Officer Daniels and the precinct. The tension was palpable. The crowd split down ideological lines, each side shouting to drown out the other. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere was equally charged. Marcus and Margaret sat side by side at the plaintiff's table, flanked by Jasmine Carter and her team of attorneys. Across the aisle sat Officer Daniels, flanked by his legal team and the stoic faces of union representatives. Margaret was calm, her hands folded neatly on the table. Marcus, however, was a storm of controlled energy, his jaw tight as he scanned the room. The stakes were higher than ever. This wasn't just about his mother anymore. It was about dismantling a system that had allowed people like Daniels to thrive unchecked. Opening statements. The trial began with the opening statements. Jasmine stood first, her presence commanding as she addressed the jury. "This case is not just about one officer's misconduct," she began, her voice steady and clear. "It's about a system that allowed this misconduct to go unchecked." Officer Daniels targeted Margaret Ellison, a 78-year-old woman, not because she broke the law, but because he thought he could. And when he was called to account for his actions, the precinct tried to protect him instead of protecting the community. Jasmine paced the courtroom as she spoke, her words weaving a narrative that captured the jury's attention. "The evidence will show a pattern of abuse, a culture of impunity, and a disregard for the very principles law enforcement is supposed to uphold." When Daniel's attorney rose for his opening statement, the tone shifted. His words were measured but carried an undercurrent of dismissal. "This case is an unfortunate misunderstanding, blown out of proportion by the media. Officer Daniels was simply doing his job, and while he may have used language that was regrettable, there is no evidence to suggest systemic wrongdoing." Marcus clenched his fists under the table, but Margaret placed a calming hand on his arm. They had expected this. The defense's strategy was to minimize, deflect, and undermine. Testimonies begin. The prosecution's first witnesses were a series of bystanders who had recorded the incident. Each described what they had seen: an elderly woman being pulled from her car, handcuffed without cause, and called a degrading slur. Their testimonies were powerful, painting a vivid picture of Daniel's actions. Next came Officer Morales, the whistleblower. Nervous but resolute, he recounted the culture of the precinct, where complaints against officers were routinely buried and misconduct was excused as necessary for the job. They called it protecting the badge, Morales said, his voice steady despite the glares from Daniel's supporters in the gallery. But all it did was protect bad cops. The defense tried to discredit Morales, questioning his motives and painting him as a disgruntled employee. But Jasmine anticipated this and had prepared him well. Morales remained composed, his answers clear and unwavering. Margaret takes the stand. When Margaret took the stand, the courtroom fell silent. She sat with her back straight, her hands folded in her lap, and her eyes steady as she faced the jury. "Mrs. Ellison," Jasmine began, her tone gentle, "can you describe what happened the day you were pulled over?" Margaret nodded. "I was driving to the grocery store, like I've done so many times before. When the officer pulled me over, I was confused. I hadn't broken any laws. But when I tried to explain that, he called me a slave." The words hung in the air, heavy and damning. Margaret's voice didn't falter as she continued. "I've lived long enough to know what that word means, the weight it carries. He used it to strip away my dignity, to make me feel small. But I refuse to let anyone make me feel less than human." Jasmine nodded, stepping closer. "And how has this incident affected you, Mrs. Ellison?" Margaret took a deep breath. "It's been hard. I've always believed in keeping my head down, staying out of trouble. But this has shown me that silence isn't enough. We have to stand up, not just for ourselves, but for everyone who has been treated this way." The defense tried to rattle her, questioning her memory and suggesting that Daniel's words had been misheard or misunderstood. But Margaret remained calm, her quiet dignity a stark contrast to their aggressive tactics. The defense stumbles. The defense's case began to unravel as Jasmine introduced the leaked emails and body cam footage. The emails revealed a concerted effort by the precinct to shield officers like Daniels, while the body cam footage showed Daniels berating other citizens in language eerily similar to what he had said to Margaret. The final blow came when Jasmine called a retired officer to the stand. Once a respected member of the precinct, he had left after growing disillusioned with its culture. "I stayed quiet for too long," he admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "I saw things I shouldn't have ignored, but seeing what happened to Mrs. Ellison, seeing her courage, it gave me the strength to speak out." Closing arguments. In her closing argument, Jasmine addressed the jury with passion and conviction. "This case is about accountability," she said. "It's about saying enough is enough. Margaret Ellison represents the strength and resilience of every person who has ever been mistreated by those in power, but she shouldn't have to. It's time for this system to change, and that change starts here." The defense's closing argument was lackluster, their attempts to minimize the evidence falling flat in the face of the overwhelming facts. The verdict. The jury deliberated for 2 days, the tension in the courthouse growing with each passing hour. When they finally returned, the atmosphere was electric. The foreperson stood, her expression unreadable as she announced the verdict. "We find the defendant, Officer Daniels, guilty of misconduct and violation of civil rights." The courtroom erupted in noise. Cheers from Margaret's supporters, gasps from Daniel's camp. Marcus let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, his hand gripping his mother's. Margaret turned to him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "We did it," she whispered. The aftermath. The verdict was a turning point. The Department of Justice's investigation expanded, uncovering widespread corruption in the precinct. Several high-ranking officials resigned, and new policies were implemented to ensure greater accountability and transparency. Margaret became a symbol of resilience and justice, her story inspiring a wave of reforms across the country. Marcus, ever her protector, continued to fight for systemic change, using his platform to advocate for better training and oversight in law enforcement. As they stood together on their porch one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Margaret turned to Marcus. "You've always been my hero," she said softly. Marcus smiled, his arm around her shoulders. "And you've always been mine." For the first time in weeks, the world felt a little lighter. The fight wasn't over, but they had proven that justice, though hard won, was always worth fighting for.